Jesus.
Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Make him the cutest that I've ever seen.
Hello friendos, this is Chain, welcoming you back to Chain of Commander. It is time for our April Patron's Choice Deck Tech of the month, and for this month I gave my patrons the choice of the four most, the decks I have the most invested in. The four decks, my four most expensive decks, more or less. And out of those, they chose Hazezon Tamar as the deck they wanted to see. Before we get into it, I will let you know, I put a deck list for this down in the description below to reference at your leisure. And if any of these cards seem like something you want to pick up from one of your decks, definitely consider using that TCG Player affiliate link below. Won't cost you a single cent more, but it will help out the channel. That said, let's take a look at Mr. Tamar here. Hazezon Tamar is 4 white, green, red for a 2/4 legendary human warrior that says, when Hazezon Tamar enters the battlefield, create X/1/1 Sand Warrior creature tokens that are red, green, and white at the beginning of your next upkeep, where X is the number of lands you control at that time. And then he has a second ability that says, when Hazezon leaves the battlefield, exile all Sand Warriors. An important thing to note about these two abilities, they are separate abilities. They are separate triggers that occur separately of each other. So, if you have a way to get Hazezon to enter the battlefield and then leave the battlefield before his first trigger resolves, there won't be any tokens for his second ability to exile. So when those tokens do come in, you get to keep them around. Now this deck, Hazezon himself, he references wanting to see many lands to get more tokens. So this is a land-centric kind of deck. You folks at home, you know, I like to start my deck techs with the ramp, and a deck like this, it's gonna have a lot of ramp. So let's just jump right into it. As I just said, we have a bunch of ramp that we gotta get through here. So we got things that let us play extra lands per turn in Dryad of the Elysian Grove and Oracle of Moldiah. Dryad has a little bit of an extra bonus because he also allows our lands to tap for any color, which in a 3-color deck comes in pretty handy. Then we have a couple of gods off of Theros. We have Karametra, God of Harvest, which lets us get a land out of our deck anytime we cast a creature, and Clothos, God of Destiny, which can slowly chip away at some opponents' graveyards, and in the process, either do a little bit incremental damage to them, or get us a little bit extra mana to work with each turn. We have a couple of creatures that are just known to get lands out of our deck. It's Secure Tribe Elder, which you can sack to grab a basic, and then Wood Elves, which will bring you a forest when it enters the battlefield. We have the 2 3-mana ramp spells that are pretty common in EDH at this point in Cultivate and Kodama's Reach. Both of them can get a basic to our battlefield as well as to our hand. And then we have a slew of the 2-mana ramp spells, Ramping Growth, Nature's Lore, Farseek, and 3 visits, which I picked up for this deck before the reprint was announced, and it is so pretty. Then we have Growing Rights of Itlamok. This isn't itself ramp, but it does flip over if we control enough creatures, and we'll end up controlling enough creatures more than enough times with this deck to flip it. And when it flips, it essentially becomes Gaia's Cradle, becomes Itlamok, Cradle of the Sun, which is a fixed Gaia's Cradle in the fact that it can still produce mana even if you don't have any creatures. Then we have another enchantment in Mirari's Wake. This will double up on our land mana production, allowing us to play more things, twice the amount of mana for the amount of lands we have, and it gives all our creatures +1/+1. So all of our tokens, of which are normally 1/1s, they're now 2/2s. Get a little bit of extra punch and power in there. And then lastly, we only have 1 mana rock in this deck, and it isn't Soul Ring. In fact, it is Selesnya Signet. This is a very colored mana-intensive deck, so I figured we would only play a rock in here that can really help us meet those mana requirements. As such, Soul Ring was the rock of choice. We have plenty of ramp. We do. So we'll be able to have plenty of land, but how do we make sure we continuously have spells to cast with this mana? Well, for that, I'm going to have to take you on a tour of our card advantage. All right, as far as our card advantage is concerned, this is a very creature-centric deck. So a lot of our card advantage is, surprisingly to no one, very creature-centric. In fact, a good chunk of it is on creatures themselves. Things like COARSE of Crufix, which lets us play lands from the top of our deck as if they were from our hand. Eternal Witness, which can get back a card from our graveyard to use again in the future. Beast Whisperer, which just draws us cards for playing creatures, which we're going to be doing so much in this deck. Mentor of the Meek. This one allows us to pay 1 mana whenever a tiny creature enters the battlefield to draw an additional card. Runic Armasaur. This one doesn't give us the control over the draw. This one we have to rely on our opponents, but whenever our opponents activate an ability of a creature or a land that's not a mana ability, we'll be drawing a card. Now we have a couple more things that give us some card advantage just by playing creatures. We have Lifecrafter's Bestiary, which, very similar to Mentor of the Meek, allows us to pay extra mana when we cast a spell in this case to draw a card. And then Shamanic Revelation, so that once we have all those creatures on the field, we can draw cards equal to those creatures, and we'll gain some extra life for all the big creatures we have. Then we have a bunch of tutors, all these tutors designed to get creatures out of our decks. We have Court of Calling, which is an instant speed one that puts it right on the battlefield. Eladamri's Call, instant speed, but goes to our hand instead. Green Sun Zenith. This is a sorcery, but can get us any green creature out of our deck, mana cost X or less. I have a cool trick to talk on that one a little bit later, so keep out an eye out for that. And then Tooth and Nail. Tooth and Nail would either get us 2 cards, 2 creatures from our deck and put it to your hand, or it puts 2 creatures from our hand onto the battlefield, or both if we pay the Entwine cost. So this one quite frequently ends up being a win condition, and I'll talk a little bit more on that one later as well. And then lastly, we have what I consider to be the ultimate green card advantage engine, Sylvan Library. It's card filtering, at least when it's out there, and in best case scenario, you can dump a little bit of extra life you might have into it to get some extra card draws out of it. So, because our hand is full, I am presuming in this theoretical situation that we will have answers for our opponent's things. But what might those answers be? Well, let's just check them out now. Now, as our answers are concerned, we are a token deck, and we actually have a very easy way to just refill our board after board wipes. So I decided to focus much of the removal in this deck to be on board wipes. In fact, we only have one piece of true single targeted removal in Swords to Plowshares. But beyond that, our removal suite in terms of board clears is much more invested. We have Blasphemous Act, a damage-based board clear that should be very easy to possibly cast for a single red mana quite often, just with the amount of creatures that end up being on the board in EDH. Cleansing Nova can either destroy all creatures or destroy all artifacts and enchantments. A nice little bit of flexibility there so we can handle the problematic permanents when we need to. Hour of Reckoning, this will destroy all non-token creatures, possibly leaving a good chunk of our creatures untouched. And lastly, we have Winds of Abandon. This is a card out of Modern Horizons that is essentially the mono-white Cyclonic Rift, because you can either use it as a piece of targeted removal, or if you overload it, you can exile all of your opponent's creatures at once, leaving yours untouched, allowing you to be able to swing in freely with your board to wipe them all out. Then we have something like Decimate. Decimate allows us to remove one of each permanent type that isn't a Planeswalker. Then we have a bunch of Artifact and Enchantment Hate. Night of Autumn, Reclamation Sage, Nature's Claim, and the classic Aura Shards take advantage of all the creatures entering the battlefield for us. And lastly, we have a little bit more Graveyard Hate. I know I mentioned Clothis a bit earlier, which is essentially incremental Graveyard Hate for your opponents, but then we have something like Scavenging Ooze, which we could be a little bit more targeted with, a little bit more instant speed with, and handle problematic graveyard bits when we need to. So we're removing our opponent's stuff. There is no doubt in my mind that they are likely going to try to remove a bunch of our stuff as well. Luckily, I've thought about that when building this deck, and I have a chunk of ways to protect our own board state, so let's take a look at those. Alright, as far as our protection is concerned, we actually have a good chunk dedicated to just protecting our game plan. We have things like Dragon Lord Dramoka. This cannot be countered, and when it's on the battlefield, your opponents cannot cast spells on your turn, which means as long as Dragon Lord Dramoka is out, you can cast things free of worry of being countered or instant speed removal or any sort of fancy tricks like that. Shalai, Voice of Plenty, gives our entire team hexproof, except for Shalai itself, as well as ourselves, actually. So if your opponents are trying to clear a particular creature off your side, they either need to have a board clear, or they'll need to waste one piece of target removal to remove Shalai before they get the piece they really want to go after. Shalai also has an activated ability to start buffing up our team, so as the late game goes on, the more mana we can pump into it, the bigger our creatures get. And then we have one more creature to help us out. We have Sigarda, Host of Herons. This is the original Sigarda that makes it so that we cannot sack creatures to spells or abilities our opponents control. So don't worry about that, all is dust. Don't worry about that Aristocrats player with Grave Pact. Our stuff gets to stick around. Then we have two non-creature spells that help protect us, and you're probably not going to be too surprised what they are. Heroic Intervention, very mana efficient way to give our entire team hexproof and indestructible. In fact, gives all of our permanents hexproof and indestructible. And then lastly, if Heroic Intervention for some reason isn't doing it for us and we just got to poof on out of there, we have Teferi's Protection to just hide away, bury ourselves underground until our next upkeep. So that is the way we will protect ourselves. And we're about to get into the meat and potatoes of this deck, but I have a question for you folks. How have you been liking it so far? Have you been enjoying this list? Then definitely make sure you hit that like button down below to show it, because we are about to get into the even better part of this deck. So let's check out the token producers themselves. Now, Hazezon himself, he is a token producer, and that is great, but obviously we're going to want more of that effect somewhere in this deck. We want as many tokens as we can get. So we have things like Avenger of Zendikar. Enters the battlefield, brings a bunch of plant buddies with them equal to the amount of lands we control. Tristani Discordant only brings along a couple buddies, but gives all of our creatures +1/+1. And if our opponents somehow gain control of some of our creatures, we get them back at our end step. Scoot Swarm, a new card from Zendikar Rising that makes pretty much tokens as you play lands, and once you start playing enough lands, it starts making token copies of itself, and at that point it's just exponential growth every time you play a land. Heliod, God of the Sun. This is one of the Theros guys that lets you just dump mana in it to make cleric tokens so that you can just always have some use for the mana that you got out there. And then we have a handful of X spells that just produces a bunch of tokens all at once. March of the Multitudes and Secure the Waste. These are both instant speed X spells that can produce a whole bunch of tokens just equal to the amount we pump into X. And March of the Multitudes has the added bonus of having Convoke, which means if we already have a bunch of creatures or tokens out there, they can assist to paying that X cost. And then we have Martial Coup. This is one that I debated putting into the board clear as well, because it serves as both a token producer and a board clear. It produces tokens, but if your X cost is 5 or greater, it destroys all other creatures as well, leaving presumably just those tokens on the field for you. But let's say we want more tokens. We want these guys to produce more things. We have ways to double. We have things like Parallel Lives and Anointed Procession. These are the green and white versions that essentially double up on all of your token production. And then we have Doubling Season. Also doubles up on our token production, but it includes doubling up on our counter production as well. For whenever we need to put a 1/1 counter on a creature, it doubles up on that. Then we have Legion's Landing. This is just a 1-drop enchantment that comes in with a vampire, but if we attack with enough creatures, we can flip it, and then it becomes a white mana producing land that can also produce as vampire tokens by pumping mana into it. Divine Visitation. This is a spicy card indeed. I had Cathar's Crusade in this deck, but I ended up switching it out for Divine Visitation because of the cool interaction it has with Hazezon. Divine Visitation essentially is a replacement effect that turns all your creature token production into 4/4 angels. So for Hazezon, he would normally produce the Sand Warriors that would be prone to being exiled when Hazezon leaves the battlefield. But in this case, if you have Divine Visitation out, Hazezon ends up producing angels instead. So if Hazezon leaves the battlefield, those angels are safe because they're not Sand Warriors. A really cool interaction that definitely made Divine Visitation find a home in this deck. And lastly, as far as our tokens are concerned, we actually have a little bit more versatile than just token production. We have Elspeth, Sun's Champion, produces a bunch of tokens, but also can remove all the big creatures off the table. But also, if you manage to ultimate it, it just becomes an ultimate anthem for your team. So the thing about tokens, though, is you can have a whole bunch of them, but quite often they come in quite small. Most of the token production in this deck is 1/1s. So how do we translate these 1/1s into death? I have plans for that. So as far as the death portion of this is concerned, we have a handful of ways that we kind of make our tokens a bit more lethal in the process. We have things like Suture Priest. This one doesn't really make our tokens lethal, but this one makes our tokens gain us a lot of life, and then our opponent's creatures, as they enter, will slowly chip away at their life total. Samet, Voice of Dissent, not necessarily a way to make our tokens deadly, but it makes them fast. So if we are able to produce a bunch of tokens at once, instead of having to wait a whole turn cycle before we attack with them, Samet can give them haste. Another good replacement for this, if you don't have a Samet, if you have Tuk Tuk Rumblefort, which was the common out of Zendikar Rising, works just as well in this slot. Nylea, God of the Hunt. This is the 4th Theros god I have mentioned in this deck. Gives all of our creatures trample, and is also a mana dump that we could dump to give creatures, individual creatures, power and toughness boost for the turn. Then we have 2 of the most iconic green finishers for creature decks in EDH. We have Craterhoof Behemoth for stomping and Triumph of the Hordes for infect. Earlier I mentioned that Tooth and Nail can be a win con. That's because if we have any amount of creatures out already, we can use Tooth and Nail to get Avenger of Zendikar and Craterhoof Behemoth onto the field at the same time to make a whole bunch of tokens, make everything else really big, and swing in to get a bunch of massive damage in. But let's say we can't attack. For whatever reason, everybody's got a sphere of safety and it pays a bajillion mana to attack anybody, and it's just not possible. We have ways to win around that as well. We have Impact Tremors to do 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters the battlefield on our side, or Perforos, God of the Forge, the 5th Theros god in this deck, that just does 2 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters the battlefield. So even if they got their little pillow fort set up, we can still blast that damage through and finish out the game. So that's primarily the game plan here. I hope you folks are liking it for. We only have the mana base to go over yet, and this is probably the most in-depth mana base I had to build for a deck in a while. So if you've been enjoying it so far, definitely hit that subscribe button. I'd love to have you folks join us going forward for future deck techs and just hanging out and doing some general chit-chat on the Commander format. That said, let's get into this mana base here. Home stretch. Let's wrap this up. All right. I designed this mana base with the entire thought that whenever you get a land out of your deck for whatever reason, whether you crack a fetch land, or you play a Wood Elves, or you get a trigger from Karametra, there is always a very good land you can get to enter the battlefield, whether it be tapped or untapped when you need to. So starting, we have the fetches, great easy way to fix, an Arid Mesa, Windswept Heath, and Wooded Foothills. I only like to play the on-colored fetches in the spirit of the format, but obviously if you want more, this deck will work even better with more fetches in it. Then we have Corrosive Verge. This is a pretty slow fetch land. It enters tapped, you got to pay to use it, and then it gets 2 lands tapped. So the only outright super tap land in this deck is a bit slow. Might cut it in the future. And then we got a bunch of things for these fetch lands to go get. We have Dryad Arbor, a great way to just get a surprise blocker or an enter the battlefield trigger off of one of our creatures when we need to. And this plays very nicely with the aforementioned Grease on Zenith, where we can just pay 1 mana to pay for the base cost of Green Sun Zenith, where X equals 0, and go get Dryad Arbor as a green creature with a CMC 0 that essentially, boom, Green Sun Zenith, 1 mana ramp. That's pretty fantastic. Then we have the 2 from Battle for Zendikar, the Tango Lands and Canopy Vista and Cinderglade. We have the Bicycle Lands from Amonkhet in Scattered Groves and Sheltered Thicket. And then we have the 3 on-color shocks in Sacred Foundry, Stomping Ground, and Temple Garden. And lastly, we have 1 true duel for this deck, and that is Savannah. Why only 1? Because I am not as rich as I pretend to be, and they are very hard to get the other ones. That said, Savannah is the best one to have because this is a very green-white intensive deck. So as much green and white lands as we can fit in here, the better. That in mind, we have a bunch more lands here that are really just entirely dedicated to make sure we get green and white production. We have Bountiful Brahmana that enters untapped, and we have multiple opponents. Brushland, which is the Pain land. Fortified Village. This is the reveal land that the cycle is finishing up here in Strixhaven, which I'm kind of excited for. Grasslands, Horizon Canopy. That's the one that we can sack to draw a card if we need to. Razorverse Thicket only enters untapped within the first 3 lands that we play, but there's still that chance that it can enter untapped for us. Selesnya Sanctuary. This is the only other tap land in this deck that produces colored mana. But it's a bounced land, so it can help us trigger future land drops, as well as it produces double the amount of mana. Sungrass Prairie, Sunpetal Grove, Temple of Plenty, which allows us to scry when it enters, and Wooded Bastion wrap up the green-white dual lands to help us hit our colored mana sources. And lastly, we have one tri-colored land, Command Tower, the only one that can produce all of our colors. Looking forward for when that Naya Triome finally gets released, but till then, Command Tower it is. Then we have a handful of utility spells. The thing about utility spells is that they very rarely produce colored mana, and in a 3-color deck, you want to limit the amount of lands you have that don't produce colored mana. That said, we got to make sure the ones we have are impactful. So we have Field of the Dead. With so many different lands in this deck, it's very easy for us to get to the 7 different named lands this needs to start pumping out zombie tokens, and very quickly starts filling the board with zombies that you can run people over with. Gavany Township has an activated ability very similar to Shali's, where it can give all of our creatures +1/+1 counters and make them more lethal threats as the game goes on. High Market. This one, you can tap to sack a creature and gain 1 life. The reason why this one is in here is because of Hazezon. I mentioned earlier, if you find a way to get rid of Hazezon before his next upkeep trigger finally resolves, you get to keep those tokens. So his High Market is a great way to get rid of Hazezon within the turn cycle for free, so that you can keep your Sand Warrior tokens. And then lastly, I'm not entirely sure why I have this in here, to be honest, but I do have Reliquary Tower in the current list. I probably should be swapping that for the green-white snow tap duel from Kaldheim here, but for the time being, Reliquary Tower in there, just in case for some reason you end up with more than 7 cards in hand. And then as far as our basics are concerned, we have 1 plains, 1 snow-covered plains, 1 mountain, 2 forests, and 2 snow-covered forests. The reason why we play the snow-covered variants in here is to kind of assist the Field of the Dead. There's really no downside at this point to play those snow lands in addition to the regular lands, and then Field of the Dead can get some extra triggers. So the point of this deck, really straightforward. Make a bunch of tokens, make the tokens big, swing with them, and when in doubt, Perforos everybody to death. A really straightforward deck. I like using this deck. I give it to my friends who are just starting out Magic because it's a very low learning curve, very straight to the point. Plays out itself very, very nicely. And now I want to hear from you folks. I want to hear if you have a Hazezon Tamar deck. I want to hear if there's some cards in that deck that I didn't mention that you love. I'd like to see how you folks build, or see your folks take on the same guy. I'd love to hear it. And also, next month's Patron Choice Deck Tech, I have given my patrons the choice of the 4 Lorehold legendary creatures to be coming out of the main Strixhaven set. Not counting the cool one out of the Commander Precon, though I do think that one is incredibly cool. But the 4 Lorehold commanders out of the set, those are the choices you have if you are a patron to choose for next month's Deck Tech. So, if you want to have a say in what I say, definitely consider signing up for a Patreon. Every tier has its choice in these votes, and even some tiers have the ability to nominate specific commanders for the votes themselves. So, definitely consider checking that out. There's a tier for everybody. But beyond that, thank you all very much for joining me today. I love hanging out with you folks, and I'll see you guys again in the future.